How is it going, guys? And welcome back to another video over here on YouTube. In today's installment, we're going to jump into a live 6-tabling session on GG Poker. I'm playing 2-5 and 5-10 PLO. And the objective of this video is to start out a series where I'm going to talk about how to consistently improve your game at Pot Limit Omaha Cash. I'm going to do that by demonstrating, first of all, some gameplay that I'm playing myself, anywhere between 30 minutes to 45 minutes. You're going to see a lot of hands because we're playing 6 tables. A lot of hands that are also quite standard, where I'm just folding, for example, pre-flop. But also I'm going to point out some of the more difficult spots or situations we get into that we then want to analyze afterwards in this afterwards analysis part. So this will be a mix between playing first and then afterwards analyzing the gameplay. Over here in this table, we have a limper in the cutoff. I'm going to raise him with my double suited rundown. These hands in general lose a lot of value the shorter you get. But against the limping range, I do want to have some of those hands in my ISO raising range, not only big pairs and big hearts. And the most premium ones, which means the ones that have the best connectivity, are generally suitable. On this flop, I will just check and not spend too much time explaining why, unless we have the time. And now the question is, do we check call or check raise? I would say my range in this spot generally wants to check call a lot. Apart from check folding, of course. So we're going to do that and play the turn. And on the turn, it really depends on his bet size because he only has a stack to pot ratio of 2. I can also see myself just shoving. He has 20 behind. There is a hard draw rolling off now. So I'm going to just put it in here at this point. And he's contemplating the fold, which kind of just showcases that we did bait him into going for a bluff, basically, on the flop and turn. Maybe he did connect somehow to the turn. We will see. And he goes ahead and folds, and we got a pretty nice amount of profit there. Him stabbing twice, you know, that's wore 14 big blinds, right? He was stabbing the flop for 4 and the turn for 10. And we probably performed a lot better by checking flop and check calling instead of going for a check raise and then going for the c-bet ourselves and trapping him that way. Which kind of leads me to the first tip of today's video, which is that a lot of people, when they get started in PLO, even quite far into their career, so to speak, they play a very overprotective. So getting outdrawn is this whole concept of a lot of people associate a lot of pain with getting outdrawn. You know, oh, if you got outdrawn, it's terrible, or it's your fault because you slow played the hand, you didn't protect your hand. And if you look back at how a no limit hold'em got started, you know, like 10 years ago or something, this thought, this fear of getting outdrawn was also very, very present. And it's not anymore today because it's not theoretically sound. You have to sometimes give your opponent chances to bluff. And the downside of that, obviously, is that they can catch up and make a better hand or potentially bluff you out of the pot. But it's part of a proper strategy. You shouldn't be too afraid of giving away free cards in certain spots. We're going to talk about which ones will make the most sense. The one where I had a straight and 2 pair makes particularly a lot of sense because the board only offers 1 straight. There is no like significant straight draw out there because the bottom 2 cards are disconnected to the top card. So those are like some structural things to take away there. When you consider slow playing, the hands that will make the most sense are the hands that are on either part of the spectrum. Either you have a very, very strong hand that has a lot of backup, which means that you're blocking your opponent's continuing ranges to begin with, or you have a hand that is the nuts right now, but has a lot of very marginal runouts, and therefore you want to keep the pot small. Usually the nutted hands in the middle of the spectrum, they're usually going to just go ahead and bet, and then the other 2 parts are going to go for the slow play. All right, so here we play blind on blind. We raise the flop. He calls, and the turn brings in the 10. So he's going to have some strong hands here. He's going to have some like queen-10 combos, also some queen-queen, but also ace-ace-king, ace-ace-jack, ace-ace-queen. Like those hands are generally going to call. I think we're going to go for this sizing. Let me just think this true. I think this is decent. Can shove river if I want to. The river is great because the river is discounting now If I had a hand like queen 6, for example, or queen 10, if he has aces, he might want to continue basically. So we will certainly shove for value. And he goes ahead and folds rather quick. All right. So here we're looking at an interesting spot. We're going to fold the river here in a moment, but basically this is a three-way pot where the small blind led into the big blind and myself. I called with middle set. When you have middle set on a heavy board, heavy means that there are two high cards on the board. You want to be very careful in PLO because set over set situations are much more likely when the board is heavy than when the board is light. So when he leads in there, he has a lot of kings, but also some straight draws. We're not crushing the straight draws, but we are crushed by the pocket kings region. And then he barrels turn, which was a blank for a pot, which is good. Like if he bets, he wants to go ahead and pot this card. But the river is a jack, and he goes ahead and pots as well. And I think on the river, his range significantly takes a hit because he represents basically king-king. And he certainly wants to consider checking there or going for a block. But like potting the river is certainly part of the strategy, but I can't imagine it's a big part of it just because he shouldn't improve very much on the river. And when people suddenly represent very strong hands and on cards they shouldn't improve on, they're rarely bluffing. I think this is because psychologically, you know you can't rep it, and when they rep it still, they have it very, very often. You know, everyone has, especially beginner players, they think about this question, does my story make sense, right? And if it doesn't make sense, they're very much afraid of bluffing. Here, this guy leads on the turn. We can call or raise, but a lot of beginner players in PLO, again, they play overprotective, so they tend to have hands like sets or two pairs in the spot that you want to maximize value against and also protection. So we're going to shove. And he does go ahead and call. And he does have a set and a flush draw, which is weaker than our flush draw. Okay, we're on it twice. He hits the first, and we win the second, so we split this pot. All right. So that was a pretty decent example of like an overprotective style. That's a great flop. Now, this time, this is also a heavy board, but we do have backup in the form of an open-ended straight draw in case we do run into a set. And also, the stack-to-pot ratios are much shallower. Stack-to-pot ratios are driving a lot of the decision-making in PLO. So it depends a lot whether you have an SPR here of 3 or if you have an SPR of 12 when you are pushing with hands like middle set, for example. So we get it in. And we're up against a lower set, which is a good starting point. And we will take down this pot. All right, over on this table, the button opens. It goes check, check on the flop, and we have to make a decision on whether to bluff the turn or not. And I would say it's kind of close. We can't really check call. I'm going to start with this. Not sure if that was like the proper idea there, but it's a fine play. Like the button has a lot of snap folds. He also has some like weak ace X that just cannot continue against whatever size you use. And generally speaking, using smaller sizes is certainly something that's quite undervalued. Here we're going to 3-bet. There are a couple reasons for it. The main reason is that we don't have a nut suit and that the small blind is very shallow. So the small blind will go ahead and squeeze frequently when I call because there's already 8.5 big blinds in the middle dead. And usually what happens is the cutoff will then 4-bet and I will have to fold pre-flop. So in order to prevent that, I'm going to 3-bet myself. And now we still have to fold against the 4-bet. But I hopefully you can see the point of like why 3-betting there a little bit lighter makes more sense as one of the guys behind is very, very shallow. All right, we'll get the money in here pre-flop against kings, which is also, let's do it one time, which is also a common mistake, overvaluing kings in PLO. Like kings play a lot different in PLO than no limit. Like the difference between kings and aces is very large. NPL, like in terms of the strength and the way you want to play the hand. Kings, oh, that's unfortunate. Kings is a hand you want to be very careful with when it comes to preflop decisions. You generally play more passive. You open raise for sure, but if you face an open raise, you're oftentimes going to end up just calling. What is up, guys? You're going to get back to the video in a moment. If you like this kind of content, then make sure to check out the PLO Mastermind at PLOmastermind.com, which is our PLO training site where you get content on a daily basis, which means 5 days a week. We produce low, mid, and high stakes PLO strategy content, as well as mental game content. Our coaches, which is myself, Schuller, Fabian, Luke, as well as Jan, our mental game coach, are dedicated to give you guys the latest information when it comes to PLO strategy on and off the table, which means we're also going to talk about study habits, how to use programs such as Hold'em Manager 3, as well as PLO Trainer, as well as showing you in plain explain videos how to beat the game at different stakes in different environments. We're talking GG poker, party poker, poker stars, with HUD, without HUDs, as well as at lower, mid, and high stakes. I'm going to head here quickly to the dashboard to give you guys an idea of what we are releasing at the moment. We have a mental game fundamental series. This is the 10th part that's just released here by Jan Filippi, our mental game coach. We also have plenty of plain explain videos at different stakes. And the GTO bit series here by Fabian talks about the most fundamental ideas of GTO, for example, and preflop and passive blockers in the specific one. Luke has a League Buster series here at the bottom where he talks about how you use Hold'em Manager 3 in order to build a better understanding of your game and your leagues as well. So you can see here he talks about different reports and how you can actually use that and leverage it in order to identify different problems. He is our low stakes coach, and you can see based on the graph in the background, he is crushing the low stakes games and will teach you how you can do just that yourself. Again, we release 5 videos every single week. We have 800 videos in the library, which you can filter for on the left-hand side over here, 4 different coaches, 4 different topics, 4 different streets, and so on. If you'd like to learn more about that, head over to PLOmastermind.com and become part of our awesome community. And now let's get back to the video. All right, here we have a decision. We can see bet, we can check back. I think we're going to see bet we have some decent combination of blockers. If we do check back, if you check back like a medium strong hand like this one, you want to think about how many turns you can call versus a bet. And if the answer is not a lot, then you're probably better just like turning your hand into a bluff and bet folding. Because your opponent is going to end up winning the pot too frequently. Like you check back and he stabs and you just fold. So the marginal hands you want to check back with on the flop, they generally should have playability. Playability means you can play versus a bet in this particular case, which means you can realize your equity. All right, we toned it down to 5 tables now because maybe that's a little bit more practical. Now, another thing that is going to help you tremendously when it comes to improving your game steadily is to ask the right questions. I like to say, or I like to use this quote that says, the quality of your questions determines the quality of your play, right? And it comes from a quote about life. The quality of your questions determines the quality of your life. But it also relates to poker, you know? The better questions you have, the better answers you will find, right? You can obviously find the answer to like a very simple question, and that is not going to help your bottom line very much. But if you can identify the right questions to ask yourself and then research for in the proper way, which we're also going to do in this series, you're going to improve a lot faster. And in order to ask the right questions, you need to understand in which spots you're not sure what you're actually doing. An easy way to identify that is to think about if you have a good idea of what your range wants to do and how the ranges, both ranges, are interacting in certain spots. For example, how often is this guy supposed to bet? What sizings are both players supposed to use? And why is that so? What kind of transitions are helpful for either player? And how does that materialize in then the actual gameplay, right? And the actual strategies. And if you don't know the answer to such questions, or you don't even know the answer by a bit, basically, you generally want to go ahead and mark that, right? And then go after it and figure out whether or not it's worthwhile to pursue the answer to this question. So I would generally separate the finding question parts to the finding answer parts, because you can find and define a lot of questions while you're playing. You know, you play hands and you see spots and you feel uncertainty in certain situations, right? But then afterwards, you need to first of all prioritize and understand how much time will it take me to find the answer to these questions, and how important or how meaningful will it be to fix a certain issue or acquire certain knowledge about a situation for my bottom line. And that sort of prioritization part is what I would push towards the improvement section, not while you're playing. While you're playing, you have enough stuff to do and worry about as far as the decisions on the tables are concerned. Here in the flop, we can go either way. Like I would usually bet most of my straight draws, but as we don't have a pair blocker and we have one of the weaker open-enders because we have no pair blocker and we have no wrap and so on, I like to check back sometimes with an open-ender. It's quite of a deceptive play. Like, again, most of the straight draws are going to be betting. So I like to be strong sometimes on the you know, on a 5, on a 10, where I'm usually not. He bets turn for pot, and river will go check, check. And he ends up having ace-9. So not a big deal there on either side. On this table, I decided to lead the flop. I'm not really sure if like leading the flop on this particular texture is like a big thing. But I think if it is, then my hand makes a lot of sense. He goes ahead and raises. And we're just going to call. See some turns. We turn the nuts. And now we want to set up a jam. So the way most people play raises here is that they don't bluff very much at all, because they just don't know like which hands to use for it. And that means they're going to have a set very often. When he has Jack-9, he's going to fold anyway a lot. And he doesn't have a lot of equity. But Jack is a very, very common raise here. So we want to use a sizing where we can challenge that hand a lot. And I would say this sizing is not really going to give him the right price to continue with Jack. But even if he does, we know like what cards, you know, we're not supposed to stack up on the river. He has the same hand. Ended up raising the flop, but that would have been a dangerous flop, which is kind of another interesting principle. Like, should he shove the turn? And I would say probably not, because like our range is either the nuts, like we had either the nuts straight, or we are potentially bluffing. And I think he would benefit more from just checking, because he can bluff us out of the chop pot on the river card that we just saw. That's a little bit of an advanced concept though. But nevertheless, also his open raise was very light in the cutoff. Let me just go back to this. So he was open raising Queen, Jack, 10-6 with trip suit. Yeah, that's not going to be winning. So we're going to mark him as an active player, right? Which is another important concept. Marking people, generating reads, you know, especially when you see someone deviating from GTO. So RFI. So in this spot, we 3-bet before the flop, and we get 2 callers. This is a board that favors my range tremendously. And if the big blind has kings, you know, whatever, because the SPR, I'm gonna start betting the flop. And this is not really a thing. Like, you don't want a cold call on the stack size versus 3-bet. If your hand is strong enough to continue, you generally just want to shove pre. All right, money goes in. He ends up having 8-8, 6-7. Sorry, yeah. So the 8s are covered, that's for sure. He needs a 7 twice. All right, let's do it twice here. And we end up winning the first one. And we will probably win the second one as well. So that was also a very loose play. So cold call, 3-bet, 8-8, 7-6 rainbow, big blind on 40 big blinds. About 40 big blinds, I think it was. All right, those are like important notes to take down on, because when someone else 3-bets you and he cold calls, right, you know that you should be 4-betting wider to generate max value against a very wide range of hands that will cold call a 3-bet. And people have very different strategies when they cold call 3-bet. Some players have very, very good hands, and some players are like all over the place. And it's also, there's also a difference between being in the big blind and not for players. Like from a GTO perspective, not as much, but from like a human perspective, there are quite a few humans who cold call a lot more when they are in the big blind than when they are not. I guess because they have some money already invested into the pot, but again, a 3-bet is still a huge re-raise, and don't want to do that too often, essentially. Like, if you never cold call a 3-bet in your PLO career, you're going to be fine. Especially online. Like, live, it might be different because dynamics are different, or the meta game is different. I'm going to open raise this one and this one. But online, if you never cold call a 3-bet, and what is cold calling a 3-bet, right? It is calling a 3-bet when you're not the open raiser. So you're in the hand cold, right? All right, so here we're going to check the flop. I mean, we could also bet. But when we bet and get raised, it gets very ugly. He pots. That's also weird. So basically, he's declaring he has a stack off hand. Like, he has a hand that wants to stack off or will stack off. And that's not good news, right? Like, our blocker here doesn't help much. He has a hand that will stack off. It's pretty clear. But I think we have enough equity with the backdoor flush to justify making the call. Turn isn't great for our hand. We will check. And if he shoves, we're just going to fold. We only have one pair in a gutter. Just priced out, basically. So we're out. On this table, we check the flop and the turn, and we're going to check raise the turn now, big, because he has a cap range. 1 second. So one of the things that is, we're also going to barrel river, by the way. I mean, we should barrel river some of the time, like not always, but I think that it's a pretty decent spot. And obviously at this point, he's going to have a 7. Like, he's going to have 10-7 or 7x usually, like very frequent. But what people generally don't do is they don't slow play like kinking when they check back, which is okay, which is not a bad strategy. But then you have to be aware of that and then call down lighter versus this kind of line. All right, so here we do flop a set. Let's think this true. This guy is the open raiser cold call. We called as well. One misconception about PLO is also that like you shouldn't play low pairs because they're dominated. Yes, they are dominated, but you're still going to end up making good profit on it. He bets very large. I kind of doubt he has a set of aces, but we're still not going to raise him. If you want to raise in these kinds of spots, you want to have a set with backup. Like an open-ended straight draw. Like when he calls, is such a weird spot now. When he calls, he is going to have an ace very often, which makes it way less likely that he has ace-ace. So I think we should actually raise. And I'm going to raise a kind of small amount. And the reason I'm doing this is because I want him to call with ace-king, essentially. That's the idea here. Again, because he calls, there's a huge card removal effect in place. He unlikely has a straight draw. He very likely has an ace, just given my hand, right? So that gave me information that my hand is good, and then decide to raise. So that's kind of the idea there. All right, the money goes in. Sure, we run it twice against the ace X. We win the first one, and we win the second one as well. All right, over in this table, we 3-bet pre-flop. This guy's already all in. He overcalled the 3-bet. Again, this happens quite frequently. Most of the money is in the main pot. There's no reason for us to bluff or whatever. We're just going to check fold our air. And we run into 2 pair. On this table, we have a straightforward fold. The low combos in PLO, they are devalued a lot if you are getting shorter or your opponents are getting shorter. So it depends on which side you're playing on. You will have to understand how to play versus short stacks very good. And again, one of the main adjustments is that ace-x will become much stronger. Big pairs will become much stronger the shorter you are. And the rundowns, even the double suited rundowns, they get devalued by a lot. And generally speaking, when you're playing short, like 50 big blinds and below, or even 60 big blinds and below, you have to play tighter. You have to play tighter before the flop because you're closer to showdown. So your hand needs generally, like, you're playing more equity driven. You don't cold call a lot essentially. You have to fold against 3-bets more often. There are less implied odds and stuff. So you end up playing tighter overall. And you will see the opposite from a lot of recreational players that play short. When they play short, they see more reasons to gamble because they don't risk as much, right? They only lose like 40 big blinds or 20 big blinds or 10 big blinds when they're in the pot. And there's something to be said about 10 big blind gambling because at 10 big blinds, you are pot committed by open raising pot pre, that you can actually play a little bit looser than at 20 big blinds for sure. Because at 20 big blinds, you will still have to fold versus 3-bets. And at 10 big blinds, you don't. So here we check back on the flop. He bets turn for half pot. We obviously call just based on equity. And river a flush. He's going to have a lot of 2 pairs. If you think about my card removal effects here, like ace 10, ace 7, ace 6, like all these combos are unblocked on my end. And we're going to bet half pot on the river. You can also wake up with ace-x of hearts and then check raises on the river. We don't want to risk too much. You can also have the king-high flush and just check call. He has ace-10 with or ace-queen with a heart. Seems to be too loose. And I'm going to mark this guy as like a kind of a station on the river. It's a little bit light there. The player in position, he definitely wants to use a half pot sizing as well. And it makes the most sense. Like, this is not a hand you want to raise here, by the way, given the stack sizes in play. It makes sense dependent on the line the hand took. Let me just donk here into the open raiser. He just calls it away very quick. And now we're going to go ahead and check. When you lead the flop in this texture and check the turn, a lot of players will fold a very high frequency. And this is a good hand to put into your check calling range because it doesn't have as much value betting. Now it goes check, check. He could have a hand like ace, ace 4, ace, ace deuce, ace, ace 3. We're going to block bet the river for 1/3. So this is like a thin bet that can get called by weaker, but we also prevent him from betting larger. That kind of idea. But essentially, river bet sizing is very much... 1 second. This guy has a very wide VPIP, and we're just going to rip the flop because he bets really large. And our playability is pretty marginal heading to the turn. Like it's hard to improve unless we hit a card like this one. So we just rip it in for a shallow stack size. The money goes in. He has the same hand. And that's that. So let's imagine let's imagine you are the aggressor in position, right? Let's talk about river bet size preferences. You go bet, right? And the river is a blank. You obviously want to use a pot size sizing only by the river. Because the story you're telling is like, I'm very strong on the flop, very strong on the turn. That's why you're betting 2 times. And your opponent's story is, I'm bluff catching you, right? And if someone is bluff catching you, you want to apply the biggest sizing possible. Now, let's imagine the line goes different. You know, you check back the flop and the turn as well, and you both arrive on the river. Now the story is both ranges are very capped, and your value betting threshold goes down, and you're betting thin on the river for value, and then you put in some bluffs in there. So now you could use like a half pot size sizing. So that's like a very basic example. And there are going to be a lot of situations that are in between that, right? Where you bet and then check back, or like you check and then he donks the turn, you call, he checks the river. So there are going to be a lot of in-between scenarios. But that's the general idea. All right, so this guy raises min, we 3-bet. Like on this board, we're just going to bet our entire range. And given the SPR, I'm going to bet 1/3 or larger. Like I'm going to use 2 sizings essentially, like these and this sizing. And in this specific case, I think we're going to go with this sizing. And the reason is because I'd unblocked the spades and he's going to call probably like whatever amount, like a big amount with the spade draws. So I'm better off using this sizing. If the board would be very dry or a little bit different, I can see myself betting smaller. Or let's say I had more backup, I could also bet smaller, like a backdoor flush draw or a straight draw myself, or even a flush draw myself. All right. This one is really close, but we do have no short stack behind, and some players that are active, especially big blind, we have already a little bit of a read on who like to call the river. They're quite light. Now small blind comes into play for the squeeze. I have a note here. He squeezed king queen 5 for double before. Big blind versus EP on 2K. So this guy is capable of like squeezing some light stuff. We're going to keep that in mind as we're heading to the flop. Well, it's not going to be very helpful in this case, but we still want to keep an eye on the hand because developing reads further and further is just like extremely helpful and important. So king 8-8, like who has the edge range wise? Like this guy has some king. I have some king for sure. And then 8x is also, you know, quite equally distributed towards my range. Has like probably the most 8x. He bets 15. I mean, we're just out. The hands you want to fight back with here. I mean, king x is a great blocker to begin with. But he just goes ahead and check folds. Could also take that note. Like it's an okay note to take. Let me just see. It sometimes depends on like how many notes I have on a player, whether I want to take this additional note or not. Yeah. Okay, like squeeze, small blind versus EP, button, and then check folds, king 8-8 rainbow. Like there are some players when they do, especially the very aggressive players, when they do squeeze, they would just always bet their air. And when they check, they just always check call with like ace or king. This, like the ace-x double suit with the wheel cards, is also like a kind of bad candidate shallow, especially against players who potentially 3-bet really wide or underfold the blinds. So we're just going to fold. And there's no shame in folding, like especially when you're starting out in PLO. You don't want to play too loose pre-flop. There's no price to be won for playing especially loose. Just end up paying more rake. And also you're getting yourself into a lot of unfamiliar situations. And where you start making the mistakes, right? And you preferably don't want to make the mistakes. You want to let your opponent make the mistakes by playing too many hands, right? If you play tighter as well, you can play more tables. And again, I don't see how playing tighter is going to impact your win rate in a negative way. So just stick to some tight is right type of approach. Nothing wrong with that. So far we only have like one hand that was specifically interesting that we do want to look back into, which was just the preflop open discussing like short stack, open raising adjustments. We do want to capture some more interesting spots. We have about 15 minutes left. Hopefully we will run into some cool things. Now, also one common dynamic that happens at the lower stakes, but even here in GG at like 2-5, is you will see a lot of multi-way pots. And multi-way pots are very hard to solve for. It requires a lot of tech power and a lot of time and money to run multi-way pots, and they're difficult to understand. But maybe we're going to open some multi-way pots to like develop a specific understanding or a little bit better of an understanding for multi-way dynamics in general. We're going to check the flop here in another multi-way pot. I would say one common mistake which you can see right over here, is like betting way too big in multi-way pots. Like it doesn't make sense to bet 8.4. Like how many hands do you have in your range that are willing to bet this sizing 3-way slash stack off? Like why risk so much? If you had a hand like queen, probably want to bet smaller. If you only have a queen X, probably don't want to bet this large and then face the jack rip, for example, for stack. So it's not like the GTO sizing. He has a set and he runs into the ace king 5. This is a weird hand. Again, I mean, this is a kind of a crazy preflop hand, but I wouldn't use that kind of sizing. It's an interesting hand to take a note on as well. All right, here we probe turn. He calls. He has 2 pair. We have a set and a flush draw. Great spot. Not running it 3 times. And we do win this pot. So we have a very interesting note now on this guy, right? Like he cold called 7-7-6-3 button at 40 big blinds, right? And additionally, he c-bet like 90% pot size on queen 4-3 with mid-set 3-way. 40 big blinds effective. So that sizing tell there could be very, very valuable down the road for us. Those are the kind of notes you want to take down. As far as the label is concerned, I'm going to use this label here. And as you're building more and more reads on your opponents, you start building like a database that is worth EV, right? The more reads you have, the higher your EV will be, because you can make more accurate decisions, adjustments, and so on. Open this one. We also have double suited aces on 5-10 here, facing a limp in the small blind. I will just take a free card here. Very bad turn. He checks quick. We check as well. Don't like the river either. And we will just give up. Over on this one, it goes check, check, flop. We're going to probe the turn potting and take it down. That's also, by the way, a very common leak that a lot of lower stakes players have, or recreational players, which is their fold versus probe bet frequency is very, very high. So what does that mean? It means how often you fold when you check back the flop in position and then face a turn bet. That turn bet is called a probe. So when out of position probes, the in position player is historically underfolding, historically in terms of like database analysis. So over bluffing this node is very profitable. All right, so here we don't have a leading range. We defended the big blind. We have the weakest range in play. Great hand on the flop and the turn. He bets half pot. It could be and like ace 4, ace 8. There could be some flush draw combos. We definitely have value raising. The question is, how big do we want to raise? And I would say that we shouldn't raise too large because we have a very strong hand here. I would go a little bit more explo here. So we want to still ship river. Let's go with this sizing. We definitely want to keep in the combo draws. Wow, so this guy snap overcalls, declaring basically he has a combo draw. It's the only hand that really makes sense. Apart from maybe pocket eights. On the river, we can block bet or check. I think we're going to go with check. We don't block 6-7. And if he had a combo draw and it wasn't 6-7, then he has air now. So this is very uncomfortable now. Question is now, does he have a 6-7 or something else? It is pretty likely he has 6-7. I mean, 6-7 doesn't open this position very much. Like, you could have king 6-7 with hearts. Is that going to call turn raise? I mean, maybe. 6-7 10 is like calling pretty much always on the turn. It's just that like these combos don't really open. Like what opens is more like a jack 10 queen, which we do block, unfortunately. But the thing is, when he opens this position, it's just way more likely. We don't know like how wide he is pre-flop. So we're gonna call even though we have no 6-7. Just because of his open raising position. And yeah, he does have the 6-7. That's, you know, some combos of 6-7 will open this position. So that's very unfortunate. We could also look back into this one. I mean, it's a very difficult one to look into great detail because the node is very unusual, right? We raised the turn and he overcalled there. So clearly connected to the turn, but it could be in many ways. So that was an unfortunate river. But I think it's important on the river to realize that betting the river there, like even blocking, probably not a great play. And just going for the check and then decide option is better. All right, so here we have another spot. Let's check this one out. We open raised MP, got 2 callers. If this guy has a flush, he's not going to fold. As a starting point. This guy probably also not folding a flush. We can make some equity fold or just check. I think we're gonna go with the almost min bet and take it from there. And we get 2 callers now. All right. So that's not great. We marked him as post-flop station, which is not ideal if we're thinking of bluffing. Now, we also have to win against this guy at showdown, so we're not going to do it. He has the 9 high flush. And gets weaker to pay off, which is interesting. I mean, this guy turned to straight, but still. So here we open raise. I mean, we could go ahead and bet small, but like we're gonna get footed very often with low equity and very low visibility slash playability. So like check folding here is completely fine. Over in this table, we raised pre, and I guess the big blind now leads into us. One of the players is inactive. To his right, so he's in the big blind. He leads the 4-4-3. It kind of makes sense. I think the sizing choice is fine. We obviously call, and we'll take it from there. We're also going to call turn, so none of the draws get there, like the 5-6 type of hands. We don't block 5-6. So far we are happy to continue. And then we'll have to make a river decision. I think on the turn, he generally wants to bet bigger, because my range is very overpair heavy, and he is representing a hand that can beat that. It's going to give us a really good price to continue here with. The river also bricks off. So now the question obviously becomes, will we go for the hero call or not? We'll see what happens. He checks. Okay, that makes it a lot easier. Should we value bet? You could have a hand like the 2 kings, like some people just lead that randomly, or he has turned a queen. So we're going to do something that is not really happening in GTO. We're going to bet something like 20% of the pot on the river, or like even less, like 5 big blinds. And it will get called very often by like the queen, for example. People have a hard time folding there. Goes for the call, and he does have the queen. So that's another 5 big blinds. Now that's a huge pot there, like a huge win to win another 5 big blinds versus just checking back. Like if your default line is to check back here all the time, you are going to miss out on a ton of value. We're going to check the river here. This is blind on blind. We bet the flop, check the turn. We could also pot the turn. He has a set of 7s. That's insane. Like didn't bet the turn or the river. We save some money. Also, you want to take a note here, right? This guy, like, leads 33% on 4-4-3, big blind 3-way, with ace king queen 5, turn queen bets around half pot, river check call versus small. It's like the turn sizing was kind of weird, right? Like he turned a queen and decided to use this sort of small bet size. Almost playing according to the hand strength. I mean, he should have checked, or should have bet like really big or checked. But this medium sizing didn't really make too much sense. Over here, we ISO. Actually, we 3-bet versus a min raiser, I think. And we're going to bet the flop really small. This board, there's no need to bet massive. He makes the call. Could have like a 7-5, could have like a low flush. There are different possibilities. I think on a turn, we don't really accomplish too much by betting. So we will check and take it from there. So the 3 completes now the 7-5. So what are we beating now? That's 20. I think we can still rip if we want to. Depends a little bit like... he has a flush, most likely. I think this is a pretty cool line that is underutilized for sure. Not sure if this guy's a rack or he isn't, but we'll take the line and shove. It is also a line that is very often underutilized. Like most players, the way they play the ace of diamonds, whether it is the nut flush or the nut flush blocker. It's just like they go just 3 streets and that's it. And I think it gets a lot of credit because people assume I can't rep it because I checked the turn, but I'm still shoving, so I must have it. I think that's very often what happens there. I think the GTO solution in this case is going to look a little bit different than what I've played. But I think the flush on the river in his shoes is going to be a lot stickier than the way people play it. We're going to look this hand up and look into more details there. All right, here we will check back the flop. It will get very ugly if he is raising the flop, and we're just going to give up on the turn with the queen high. Not a big deal. Our hand also had playability, right? We can turn straight draws, we can turn flushes, we can turn straights. And again, we are not really going to make many hands that are better fold on the flop, and if we get raised, we potentially give up on a lot of equity. One thing you will see is also like a lot of these like very, very small raises, like min raises. Got to be careful to not over defend here. You're just going to end up raking away a lot of money with marginal hands that will have to check fold on the flop, turn and river very frequent, which is sort of ties into a common question people have about non-showdown winnings. Right? People look at the red line or the non-showdown winning line, and they make all sorts of assumptions about how they have to fix their game and in an aggressive way. But oftentimes the cause of it can also be you're in too many hands pre that you can't win, and then you end up folding post, and that produces a negative one at showdown, right? One without showdown. So over defending the blinds, cold calling too much in position, or open raising too much, like all that can definitely lead towards a very negative one without showdown line. We're going to leave the tables on the next big blind. Great turn card. In a multi-way pot like this, you're going to have quite a few merges on the turn here. So I'm going to use this half pot size sizing. The reason merging is more important in certain spots multi-way is because you can fold out basically more cards. A heads up, you need less protection. Multi-way, you need more because you play against more cards. River's a 3. This guy, I mean, both players can definitely have kings. So I don't think we have a value bet or a block. In a heads up pot, I think blocking could make sense because we have the top kicker to the queen. Now we're just going to check. He has a queen. He has a 7. Like, this is very loose. And we win. I mean, if we know how loose they would be, like if we knew they would be really loose pre, we could also go for the block on the river, I think. The block is also like very underexploited, which is when you use a line that is very infrequently used by the field, people generally have a very hard time finding aggressive lines against it because they're just unsure what's going on, and they don't want to get trapped into whatever, so they just end up playing a very straightforward. And that's also a big part of developing an edge, right? Is to find your own lines, so to speak. And it used to be the case that back in the days pre-solvers, you would have your own styles, right? Like this guy is using overbets. This guy is playing aggressive. This guy is playing very trappy. You know, this guy is defending the blind more often than the other players. And that's not really how it works these days anymore because a lot of these styles are just inferior to a GTO strategy and can be exploited. So the way you still develop your unique style is by using GTO supported sizings in spots other people don't use or find the sizings, right? It could be, for example, betting river very small. It could be blocking. It could be betting really big on the flop or the turn or the river. Or let's say you probe bet out of position on the turn for like a third. You're challenging your opponent's weak parts of his range. That's a solver supported line that a lot of people don't use because they haven't put in the work. So you basically put in the work into the solver in a creative fashion by finding sizings that your opponents aren't utilizing, and that's a way of creating your own style that is also solver supported. At the same time, you know, while you are developing this style, you want to make sure that you understand what you are doing. Specifically, if you bet small on the turn, you know, what does that mean for your river range, your opponent's river range when you arrive there? And if you build your own frame, your own house, right, of strategies that you're applying, you will become better at that frame over time. And because your opponents aren't exposed to a lot of players that are using the specific sizing strategy, they have a lot less experience playing it than you yourself. And that's also another way to generate a larger edge, because they're unfamiliar with your sizing choices. And even though you're still playing GTO, you're playing within a GTO frame that they're unused to. And that's the way you can develop a style and enhance your edge, essentially, because you're more familiar with that than your opponents. And it obviously takes time. It takes time in order to develop such a frame. We have at least 2 hands. I was hoping for more very interesting hands to jump into, but I think it's still worthwhile to add those 2 hands to this session and talk a little bit about like how to develop your strategy away from the tables, and what kind of tools you want to use, what kind of questions you want to ask. We could also look into our hero spot, hero calling spot, where we called the 44 big blinds in the river with the 2 pair against the 6-7 straight. And that could be an additional one that we can try to simulate for and see what's going on there. Anyhow, like 6-7 also shouldn't call turn much, because there's so many better straight draws that dominate. And especially if 6-7 has no hearts, shouldn't really call. Like the hands that probably should call that don't have a heart should be the nutted straight draws. But obviously people play different than GTO, so it's an interesting one. Anyway, we're going to jump now into the analysis portion. Hope you guys will enjoy that. All right, so now we're going to jump into the analysis portion of this video. We do see in this first hand a cutoff limper. We ISO from the big blind with 10-9-8-6 double, and he goes ahead and calls. This is going to be a difficult one to sim for, because the cutoff is not supposed to have a limping range. So we need to assign now a defined cap range for an in-position player and a strong range for out of position. I'm going to jump into PLO Trainer, which is a software you can find in the PLO Mastermind at plmastermind.com. You can click from cloud, which allows us to basically pull ranges from the cloud. And we're going to use a tight range, so the EPRFI range, in order to account for our big blind ISO raising range. And we're going to use the loosest range possible for in position, which is the button cold call. 13.55 with a 5% cap on top. And that's the way we're going to look at this hand. So the reason we're not rebuilding this entire thing in a sim is because A, it takes too much time, and B, we don't know in the first place what hands he's going to be limp calling with. But it's probably a cap range, it's probably not aces, and we probably have a tight range. So like this is a pretty good scenario to sim for. And also you generally want to look into the takeaways, the conceptual takeaways, more so than the perfect solution for the hand you actually just played. Because again, we don't really know like what hands he has pre-flop and also how he perceives post-flop. You're trying to more sort of build a strong understanding of the fundamental spots in the game, which for example is EP versus button in a single raise pot. So the flop is the 10-7-6 rainbow. So I'm looking here into our flop library. Here it is, 10-7-6. And out of position is supposed to check 83.7%. So you could justifiably just check your entire range in this spot, especially if the board is rainbow. As the board gets two-toned, you probably want to add some more bets. And we are typing in to begin with our 10-9-8-6, which is the combo we had. And we see that an 80% frequency of those combos will check, and a 20% frequency of those combos will bet. Now you want to look at for patterns. So the board has no heart. So if we had hearts, for example, we're going to go ahead and still check a very, very similar frequency. You can also add a backdoor flush draw 1. That's one backdoor flush draw. Very similar frequency, 80% checking. 2 backdoor flush draws, 86% checking. So now, as you have more backup, you generally go for more slow plays here. And if you don't have a backdoor flush draw at all, so you remove the backdoor flush draw in the syntax, 82%. So there's no big takeaway with this combo as far as should you slow play more or less with one backdoor flush draw or no backdoor flush draw. Probably if you have 2 backdoor flush draws, you have sort of a perfect slow play. But I think the bigger takeaway is that 10-7-6 is not a board you want to bet very often because you just don't hit the board very often strong enough to continue versus a raise or building a pot. So you need to push some of your or most of your strong hands into your checking range to protect the weaker portions of your range. And 10-9-8-6 is a good example for that. Most of 10-9-8-6 is going to check. You could use a randomizer and bet some of them. What are hands to be betting that will make more sense than 10-9-8-6? Probably a hand like pocket tens, ace 10, 10 deuce or so. It's betting 30% of the time. We have top set. and we can get value from hands such as an overpair with a straight draw. So in this case, it would be a hand like king, king, jack 9, jack 8, queen, queen, 5-8, for example. Like from those combos, we can get some value and start betting and building a pot. But generally speaking, our betting range is very small. So like we don't have to push too many hands in there. If you look at some low EV, like this row here is sorted by EV. You scroll down, you can see some like lower EV hands. Like what are some hands we might bluff at a higher frequency? Maybe a hand like ace, king, jack 9 with 3 clubs. So that would be the nut gut shot in the backdoor, not flush draw. This is sort of a high frequency bet, I guess, because we can't really check call. Could be a hand like ace, queen, jack 8, sort of the same story. We have the backdoor, not flush draw, not gut shot on the flop. Like those hands could also find their way into our betting range. And then most of the other hands that already have a pair, they probably just go for check call. So we go ahead and check, as will most of our range. Again, the most important part of that is to build some strong hands into your checking range. Your opponent bets half pot, or our opponent bets half pot. And this is kind of interesting. Like we are still check raising 16.7% at 100 big blinds. That is more than I thought. If you look at 10, 9, 8, 6, this hand is still going to be calling the majority of the time, 80% of the time. If we do have 2 backdoor flush draws, we're going to check call actually 95% of the time. Need less protection. We can face the second, third barrel more often than call down. If we have no backdoor flush draw, we're supposed to still call most of the time, 88% of the time. I guess if we have one backdoor flush draw, we're going to raise the most frequent then. 16. Backdoor flush draw 1. 27.5% with one backdoor flush draw. So our hand, I mean, the S pair is a little bit different. Could also just check raise the flop right away. But I would say most players attack the flop very aggressive, and they might double barrel wide as well. What are some of the bluffs we could have on the flop? Not at this SPR, but maybe at a higher SPR where we're playing 100 big blinds. So again, we're going to remove the filter. We're going to go to the raising column on the right-hand side, and we're going to scroll down in terms of EV. And we look at some of the more marginal hands, like an ace 10, 9, 9, which is quite natural. We have the straight blockers and a straight draw and a backdoor flush draw. King, jack 10, 9 could also be a check raise, or jack, jack 10, 8 could also be a raise. So basically a straight draw with a pair blocker is pretty good combo. Like these can also check call, but you want to build some of them into your check raising range in order to apply pressure to a wide stabbing range. You can see in position was supposed to stab here, 55.4%. So you will have some mergy hands in there, like overpairs and straight blockers, and it's fine to just get rid of them right away by check raising. A hand, again, for example, like the ace jack 10 9 in this case. So if you have a hand like ace jack 10 9, if you have a hand like jack jack 10 8, like those hands shouldn't always go into your check calling range. You want to check raise with them as well. And then this combo here could also be a check raise some of the time, but it's also a really good trap. What about the ace 10 10 deuce, by the way? Ace 10 10 deuce probably depends a little bit. Oh no, it doesn't. It just check raises all the time and starts building a pot, even though straight is already possible. So I felt that was an interesting first hand. We did check call the flop, which is fine. We can also check raise with this combo. The thing is, the shorter you get, the more attractive slow playing becomes, because you need less protection. And you will get the money anyway in on the turn of the river without raising at any point. So that's why slow playing at shallower stacks doesn't make sense. I decided to ship the turn. And it just depends, you know, who you're playing against. The turn brings 5-8. You can still have 2 pair. You can have flush draws. You can have combo draws. You can have a lot of stuff that can still call off, or we deny a lot of equity to. So it's both fine. He tanked and then folded. So let's move over to the next spot. So here is our second hand of interest. We open cutoff with ace, king, king 6 with the king of diamonds and the small blind cold calls. Flop is queen, jack 7, two-toned. And I decided to c-bet the flop here for my standard sizing of 75% of the pot, reasoning that my hand isn't good enough to check back and then play turns versus probe, and therefore I want to turn my hand into a bluff. Now this turns out to be wrong in this case. I should have checked back, and I want to talk a little bit about the general dynamics that happen when it comes to a cutoff versus small blind versus cutoff versus big blind. So against the big blind, the heavy boards, the king high boards, the queen high boards, the jack high boards, they have very small lead frequencies, if at all. The small blind, though, has a much different range. The small blind has a very defined range, only a couple of percentage points, and he is going to suffer on the A-side boards, but he's going to be in an advantage actually on the Broadway boards, because a lot of the queens and the kings pre-flop, as well as singles with Broadways, are going to cold call the small blind. And we're looking here at a Monker solution for cutoff versus small blind. And you can see that the small blind is supposed to lead this texture 37.9% of the time. So that's a very high frequency, something you don't want to miss out on. If you do miss out this node, if you just check your full range here, you're going to give up quite a bit of edge to your opponent, or quite a bit of EV. The general dynamic on many stakes is that the small blind does not have the appropriate lead frequency on these boards, and the exploit for in position would be to then check back more often. So in this case, he would see bet only 38% of his range, and against a player who has no lead frequency, or he has a lead frequency of, let's say, 15% or so, you probably want to check back either your entire range or almost your entire range, which already sort of pinpoints to the fact that this probably is not going to be a bet because the board isn't that great. Quick look at the equity distribution graph. This will also be a feature we're going to include into PLO Trainer in the nearby future. You can see here that the small blinds distribution, which is the distribution in blue, is ahead of the red distribution, which means we have, or the small blind has more equity across the board, and that means that the lead frequency comes quite natural. Now, if you look at our hand, which was the ace of hearts, which is an offsuit ace, basically no diamond, no spade on this board, the king of spades blocker, king of hearts, six of hearts, you will find that checking back has a expected value of 6,555 milli small blinds, and then betting is at 6,002. And I want to illustrate here the importance of understanding EV and EV differences. So when you look at certain hands and their decision to bet the flop or not, or take whatever action you want, in comparison to another action, you will see Monker solver making harsh decisions, which means if one action is just 1 milli small blind better than the other, it will always go for the highest EV option, which is sort of something a lot of people don't know about solvers, but solvers are always going to choose the highest EV option. They will never sacrifice EV for whatever other goal. Now, the tricky point here is, though, that certain hands, when they're very close to each other, it doesn't really matter for your bottom line whether you take line A or line B, and you want to start developing a better understanding of when you are just in an inaccuracy, so to speak, so you're very close to the optimal, and it will not affect your bottom line to take another option, or if you're actually blundering a spot and you make a sort of a more massive mistake. So in this case, what we're going to do is just some quick math here. We're going to bring in the calculator, and we're going to type in the EV of our best line, which is 6,555. And then we're going to subtract the 6,002 and see that there's a 553 milli small blind difference. Now we're going to go ahead and do some simple math. There's 16,000 milli small blinds in the middle. You can see it over here. The pot is 16,000 milli small blinds. And you're going to use the 500 and what is it, 53? Let's just use 500 and yes, 53. Yes. Difference. And you can see you are basically losing about 3.5% of the pot, which is pretty significant, making this mistake. And I would say not checking back here is probably a blunder. It's like a mistake, essentially. Maybe it's not a blunder, but it's a mistake. And it can obviously scale up to other combos. So like if you are c-betting the ace king king with a king of spades blocker here with a 6 on a side, you might choose a lot of similar combos and do it as well. And that's the way this mistake sort of scales up. So you're not only going to make this mistake with one combo, it's a conceptual mistake, right, that I have made here that is going to scale up and then accumulate to a larger loss in EV in my strategy. So if you compare this mistake, let's say, with another hand, for example, if we had ace king 5-4, where we do not have the pair already, we have no showdown value, so to speak. You can see that this combo here at the very top right is actually going to be a pure c-bet with the king of spades. So like the showdown value we have in our hand is the determining factor that makes us want to check back. And if you look at low EV combos that are betting, it's not linear. No, it's not like ace, king, king, 6 isn't strong enough to bet the flop. It's just that the check back option is too valuable to sacrifice it for a bet. And if we go into the low EV bets here at the bottom, we're looking at combos. Let's say this is sorted by probability. Let's sort by EV. and we go towards the bottom where you see the more marginal combos that do want to see bet bluff, for example, you'll see that an ace 10 3 deuce would actually be betting a pure frequency. Ace king 5 4, as mentioned before, could be an interesting candidate, especially if you have the backdoor ace of diamonds. 10 10 4 6 with backdoor diamonds is also going to be a bet. So it's not a linear strategy. And it's a conceptual mistake we made there with the overpair that is supposed to check back. And last thing to consider is if the small blind doesn't lead to the appropriate frequency, the 37.9%, then betting marginal hands, especially with showdown, becomes even less profitable because we're going to face check raises more frequently in this case, and we end up sacrificing not only our equity with the overpair not gutter, but also what happens is that if we get check raised by queen queen, we're also giving up on our future blockers, which might have won us the pot. So in this case, let's say he has ace queen queen of spades, he check rips the flop, we give up. We not only give up on the 2 kings that we can hit as well as the 10, but also if it goes check check on the flop, which we can control, the turn could be a diamond and we can double barrel and get him off the queens. It could be a king and we make the best hand, we can start value betting. It could be a card like an ace and we have blockers, we can start barreling, or a 9 we have blockers, we can start barreling as well. And we are giving up on all that potential by bet folding the flop now here. So an interesting hand and also some important takeaways there for myself. So the next hand that was interesting was this one. We had queen queen 10 9 led the flop cutoff versus big blind. We led from the big blind, we got pot raised by our opponent in the cutoff, and we decided to just call the flop. So the first thing to learn here is whether or not we should develop leading ranges on jack high boards that are rainbow. I'm going to use PLO Trainer. We're going to simulate the spot. So cutoff opens, big blind calls, and we're going to choose a flop from the library that is similar. So jack 9 deuce rainbow. We're going to use jack 8 deuce rainbow. And the lead frequency over here is 15.6% for 75% of the pot. So leading on jack high boards definitely makes sense. Now, when the board actually builds a straight, you actually would have an even higher leading component. Let me just double check on that quickly. So if the board is jack 9-8, for example, or 9-7, we're leading 21% of the time. But on jack 8 deuce rainbow, we're also leading. And you can see if we filter by frequency here on the right-hand side now, what hands are high frequency leads in this case. And you will see some surprising combos here as well, like some low equity hands, like a deuce, for example, with a future straight blocker, or an ace king queen deuce, like we have like some overcards, backdoor flush draw, and a pair blocker. Definitely some surprising combos that I probably don't build into my range. I decided to lead my straight draw. And on jack 8 deuce, this would be something along the lines of a jack 9-8 combo. We have a 10-9-8 combo, so we have an open ender and a bottom pair type of hand. You can see some of these hands are leading, especially if we do have the wrap combining with the queen there. 10-9-8-7 as well, same story. We have a big straight draw as well as a pair blocker. Like some of those hands certainly are leading. This board is obviously a little bit different, but this hand could make sense. One thing that I don't like too much about this combo is that our hand is rainbow, which is going to take away some of the equity. But apart from that, I think the lead is fine. My opponent raises, and the question is, should we call or jam? And the first thing you want to look at is like, what is your equity in the spot? And I think I underestimated my equity versus his entire range, because most players, they raise jacks here for sure, but then not much else. And that's what I thought in the moment. But I think the reality could be a little bit different. Like, what if you would raise also a hand like ace 10-8 with the backdoor not flush draw? What if you would raise a hand like jack 10-8-7 or 10-8-7-6, for example? Like if you have some rappy combos and whatever, and we would actually dominate some of these hands if you would raise them. So I went over to propokertools.com where you can simulate your hand for free. You just type in the board, type in your hand, and you come up with a range essentially of your opponent, which I came up with here. 40% opening. You usually want to widen the percentages here because this is a linear range and the actual range is not linear. I'm not going to talk too much about that right now. And then I just took, sets, 2 pairs, and then wraps and over pairs with open-ended straight draws and top pairs open-ended straight draws. And we're pretty much flipping with our hand, even though we don't have a backdoor flush draw. If we were to add a backdoor flush draw to the equation, let's say we add 2 diamonds, so the queen of diamonds here at the front, we're going to move from the 48.8% to 51.10%. So there is a difference. So when you look at this range and you estimate you have about 50% equity, should you call or jam? And the answer usually lays in the positions. So in this case, we're out of position. We want to end the hand quicker because we have the positional disadvantage. And also in the general playability of your hand. If you have a lot of outs to hit on where the strength of your hand is very clear to you, you might want to just call. Let's say in this case, we had no showdown value, no overpair or top pair. We just had like a wrap. In that case, we just want to call because we know exactly where we're at on every single turn. We either have the nuts or we don't. With this hand, it's different. If the turn is, let's say, the 3 of spades or the 3 of diamonds, and he pots into us, we might just have an open-ender, but we could also fold the best hand just against the hand my opponent had, which was top pair open-ended straight draw. So the playability here, given that we're out of position, and that we don't have as much clairvoyance over our hand strength on many turn cards, makes us just want to rip the pot on the flop or rip the hand on the flop right away instead of playing turns, essentially. And I think the rest of the hand is pretty much played by itself. I then let the turn large to charge jack as much as I can, and then he jammed, and as mentioned in the video, I think he would perform a lot better by just calling the turn versus my very polarized betting. I'm going to have queen very often. I could also sometimes have queen without the queen-10 combo. But more importantly, he might get me off the queen-10 chop on the river like a deuce when he calls turn and the river pairs. So that's it for this hand. All right, so this is going to be the last hand of the video we analyze. This is actually a day later, if you can't tell. That is because I had to run this 3-way sim overnight. This sim, king, 10 deuce, 3-way, button, small blind, big blind, single raise pot ran now for 22 hours. And it still hasn't reached the accuracy I would like it to have if I would store the sim and use it in my database. So that just shows like how difficult it is and how costly it is and time intensive to solve, quote unquote, multi-way poker. And that's with only one bet sizing on the flop. Out of position has a huge advantage here, and when I say out of position, I mean the small blind in this 3-way spot, because it's a Broadway heavy board. The small blind is going to have a lot of single suited Broadway cards and also Broadway pairs, and they want to lead the flop. He's going to use a 1/3 pot size sizing. The sizing choices is something you have to experiment with in solvers. I'm not going to elaborate too much on this particular spot right here. If you'd like to learn more about it, obviously check out the PLO Mastermind. Anyhow, the small blind can lead for 1/3, 57.4%. If you look at the equity distribution, it just shows like how the equity is distributed of all the players in play on this flop. The small blind on this flop has 39.558% equity. So that's a huge equity advantage 3 ways. And he is capitalizing on that by betting small with a wide range of hands. Now, a lot of players will miss what hands you should be including into that betting range given your advantage on the flop. For example, and that's relevant for the run that we're talking about, if you have queen 10 as a blocker combo, right? Queen 10 6, for example, like 80% of those hands are going to be leading. If you run the flop long, or probably all those hands are leading. In fact, there's a pattern. If you don't have a backdoor flush, you don't lead. But if you have a backdoor flush, which most combos will, then you will lead the flop every single time. And that's a combo that almost everyone in the pool is going to miss out on. Other queen combos you're leading is probably like king, like king, queen, 3, right? You don't want to check call really the hand. You don't want to check raise the hand. So you're leading the flop. You have blockers to the top range of both players, which is king. And you also have future blockers to the straight you can apply pressure on against your opponents. A lot of players are going to miss out on these combos. And then there's also some chunk in here, you know, like ace, 5-4, like some backdoor, flush backdoor straight combo. Again, can't check call, shouldn't check raise given the lack of relevant blockers that are just going to lead out because of the equity advantage that they have. The thing, though, is that almost no one in today's day and age, at this moment at least, is going to lead the flop with such a high frequency and find these sort of combos. I mean, look at 4-4-3-3. It's leading like 50% of the time if you have a backdoor flush draw, or 2 backdoor flush draws, and then even more. So basically what I'm trying to say is that people lead very tight in this case, and that's alarming, especially if you have a bluff catcher. So this guy bets, and it's up to us, and we have mid-set. So we have Jack 10, 10, 3, and you can see all those combos are pretty much calling. There's like a small inaccuracy over here, which brings me to another misconception about the solver. The solver is not just going to spit out in whatever short time frame a perfect result. It goes to this really simple process or primitive process of just like going through billions of iterations, going into every single combo and take every single bet size that is available to see and figure out what the highest EV line is of each single combination. And that takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of iteration. It takes a lot of RAM power. And sometimes it's just not practical to just wait for 2 weeks to get like a good result. So you have to work with some inaccuracies within sims. Otherwise, you're not going to get from A to B at any reasonable time frame. So in this case, you can clearly see that there are some combos that are looking to raise, but the frequency is very low, which kind of tells us that if you don't have 2 backdoor flush draws like the 2 combos at the top, then you probably just want to call. And then you look at the broader picture and you say, like, if we have 10-10 without a king, you can see that almost all those combos will be calling unless we have a straight draw or 2 backdoor flush draws. That's where raising becomes interesting, especially against a player in the small blind who has such a wide leading range, which again, most players don't. They lead way tighter. At which point calling becomes more interesting, even if you do have those 2 backdoor flush draws. So we go ahead and call. Now, turn is the 8 of spades. And on the 8 of spades, out of position wants to just pot. Like the pot size sizing is the way to go here. Again, not going to elaborate too much on sizing choices in this video. And then in position continues is going to jack 10-10-3, call with these combos unless we pick up the flush draw on the right-hand side, in which case we can also jam. Again, inaccuracies at the bottom over here, but the pattern is pretty obvious. If you have the flush draw now on the turn with your set, you are going to ship. And again, on the turn, if you look at the small blinds strategy and you look at like queen, queen, or let's say like king, king, queen, queen, you have like spades, like those hands are basically going to be betting very, very often. And then he's going to have a lot of kings. Obviously, like all the kings are going to be potting. King 10 is going to be kind of careful. If it has backup, it's going to go ahead and bet. But it looks like a lot of the queens on this card are just going to go ahead and start folding. Not folding, I mean check folding. Probably the right way to say it. Let me just go back here. Queen, queen, 10, 6. Yeah, like queen, queen without a king. Most of the combos will not go ahead and double barrel. They're going to start just check folding the turn as they didn't pick up the straight blockers or any other improvement. So he goes ahead and pots and we call. River's a jack. Let's go to the separate river sim here. And on the jack, you can see out of position is going to check 75% because it's not a great card for his range. He was representing a hand like king, king. And on the river that straight's complete on, the in position player is going to have more straights. The exit distribution tells us in position has the advantage in the straight section at the top here. Top 30% of the distribution is going to have more straights. And out of position has a high interest in checking and pot controlling. There is still some potting going on. If we look at combos that are going to pot, that are lower, less worth than, let's say, king, king. Let's see what he comes up with. He is going to have some like king, queen, queen, 6. Basically queens with a flush draw and probably a king blocker that we're betting the turn. And you also see queen, queen, jack 3 with the spades or 3 spade combo was leading the flop pot on the turn. And then some quite unnatural combos like ace, ace, 4, 7, ace, ace, 9, 3 with the 1 spade combo. Like very few people play that way pre-flop or on the flop or on the turn. It's going to be very difficult to find these bluffs basically. Once he bets river and we show up with the jack 10-10 3, you can see that almost all the combos are folding. In fact, the ones that are calling are looking at a minus EV call, which again makes it very easy to spot that this is an inaccuracy. It will converge over time when you run the sim for longer into a fold because the EV of a fold is 0, and that's better than minus 4,000, for example. Also notice one thing, when your opponent has very unnatural bluffs, so for example, ace, ace, 9, 3 in this spot with the ace of spades, or a hand like queen, queen, XX with spades that a lot of people don't have anymore because they don't lead the flop, right? Then you have to overfold the river because he's not going to find enough bluffs to compensate for the value he has or offset the value he has. And then folding the more marginal bluff catchers is a good idea. So in this case, you would sort by EV. You go to the call section versus pot. you scroll all the way down, and you look at some of those like higher frequency calls, like you're trying to find hands that basically are pure calls. We're talking about 100% frequency in this row that are kind of marginal. For example, this one here, we have Jack 10 9 7 with one spade. This one is making 2400 MSB, and the pot is already massive, you know. So those are hands, even though you do have a straight, that tend to be very poor bluff catchers against the population. King, queen, 8 deuce. So you block like the straight holding 1 queen. But again, most players just don't have enough bluffs, and therefore like folding these combos will make a lot of sense. And then calling quite nutted is probably the way to go. I ended up folding the river. Again, played this hand very standard-ish. I think him on the river, he should probably go for like a check very frequent, in which case I will have to turn some hands into a bluff myself that were peeling twice and missed on the river. I can have a lot more misses as well. Like he's going to have either a set or a straight and very few bluffs as we saw, very unnatural bluffs. I'm going to have some like missed spade draws. I could have a hand like pocket aces with spades that is blocking ace queen. Maybe I have the ace 9-3 myself, right? With like the backdoor spades that missed that could be bluffing. Let's have a look what happens in the river if you face a check. So if you face a check, we can go half pot or full pot. Half pot is not interesting for imposition here. He wants to polarize and go full pot. And then if you look at some of the bluffs, like ace 9-3 is one of the hands we would be bluffing ourselves. And he is better advised to just check maybe even his entire range and go for a bluff catch against combos like this one instead of trying to maximize with a river ace queen himself. And that's it for this video, guys. Hopefully you enjoyed it. This is the bread and butter on how I get better at poker and how I share my insight into the game by running sims and building concepts out of it. This was more of a play and explain and afterwards analysis type of format. We're going to do this more often on YouTube. Don't expect this to be necessarily a weekly thing, but it will be here and there. But if you like this breakdown of hands and the conceptual takeaways, and you want to have an even more structured form of learning with presentations, like short 10-minute presentations where I introduce a concept based on a hand or based on a spot, then definitely check out the PLO Mastermind. We have plenty of videos like that in there. And I would say with that being said, I'm out of this video. This is already long enough. Hopefully you got a lot of value and you enjoyed this one. This has been JNandez 87 out, and talk to you soon, guys.